project. And their idea was, with this mass migration, historically the largest migration, human migration, we have ever observed is happening now. It's the migration of people from rural environments to cities. So that number of people have never moved from one place to another ever before in our history. And there are going to be more people in cities increasing over the next few decades. But these new inhabitants of our cities come with these traditions. These are people who come from villages, and they have intact these community practices and traditions. So what MVRDV were proposing, why not build on those traditions of villages? Because we all know what happens when you take people like Egyptians who are very tight-knit socially and throw them into mass housing projects. It's a disaster. It doesn't work. They're unhappy. They start changing it. They start doing things to it to be able to recreate this flavor, this vocabulary, this personality, to remind themselves of the environments that they left from. So what MVRDV did is they proposed this way of thinking, of designing, rather than designing these high-rise towers in the middle of the city that no one wants to live in, design what they call vertical villages, which I thought was very, very interesting. And of course, throughout Asia, there's this move by city planners to densify the cities, and there's a lot of reasons why that's a good idea. I won't get into them. But if we assume that densification of urban environments is a good idea, how can we still preserve the sense of the human scale? If I am in Burj Khalifa on the 126th floor, I have no sense of groundedness to the place that I'm in. Another friend of mine, I'll show you their work in a moment, Yoshihiro Tsakanata, who is one of the partners in Atelier Bauau in Japan, once I was at one of his exhibitions, and what he was presenting was a very interesting phenomena that's happening in Tokyo. There are people in Tokyo who live in these high-rise apartments. They take the elevator down every morning, down to the underground that's directly under their building. They get on the train, they go to the next station where their office is, they go up the elevator to their office, they work until the end of the day, they go down the elevator again. The underground system in Tokyo is a whole parallel other city. There are supermarkets. I even saw dentists and doctors and hairdressers and supermarkets, full-blown, not little kiosks, full-on supermarkets, underground, designed to be able to provide the people of Tokyo what they needed on their way home. And he realized that there are millions of people in the city living these lives, and we know how industrious the Japanese are, and they never see daylight. They never breathe fresh air for the 7 days a week. They're going down elevators, through subways, and never reaching the ground. And that to him was problematic, and to the people of MVRDV is also problematic. But if we assume that densification is necessary, then how can we create this sense of a connection to the real world, a connection to nature, a connection to the ground with people hanging up in the sky? And these are the types of vertical village solutions that they're proposing, of bringing people into smaller communities, breaking these towers down into, similar to what the people in Tor David did in Caracas themselves, creating a more manageable set of people and more like a village community, even if it's on the 126th floor in the sky. This next group of projects is by Yoshihara and Momoyo, the ones I just mentioned, that good design is identifying potential and creating flexibility. And I think this is really important. A lot of the projects that I do in my studio, and I'm going to show you a few of them quickly at the end, is this idea of looking what we have and trying to identify spots of potential that I can work with, rather than always imagining that I have a blank page, because we never have a blank page. I mean, Ketil was talking about a landscape. If you really embrace this idea of a landscape, you never have a blank page. Even if you're building in the middle of a desert, you do not have a blank page. There are things you are responsible for incorporating into your design. So identifying potentialities in already built environments, to me, is something that's very important. And this project, I think, really symbolizes this in the best way possible. This is the BMW Pavilion as part of the Guggenheim Museum's traveling exhibition project. It's in New York City. It's designed by a wonderful, small, but very effective architectural firm called Atelier Bauau, and it's run by Momoyo Kajima and Yoshihiro Tsakanata. And BMW funded this because they wanted to experiment with a new material that they were using in their cars. Any of you who are fanatics of cars know about carbon fiber and how it's a very lightweight, very powerful material, much more powerful than steel. It's very expensive, but it's much more powerful than steel and very, very lightweight as a material to use. So they built this wonderful, it may not seem wonderful now, it'll seem wonderful as I move the slides along. So this is a tiny, tiny little space, more or less an alleyway between two buildings in New York City. And it's a discarded space that the Guggenheim Museum rented from the city for a while. And they created this box that comes and is placed in between these buildings, and it's so lightweight that it can be put on the back of a big truck and taken away and installed somewhere else. And inside this box is like a treasure box of activities that can come down and up depending on what they need to do. So the space beneath the box can become a lecture series, like what we're doing today. It can be a seminar space. It can be a space for exhibitions and street art. It can be a space that's left open during the day for individuals and people working in the city to come and sit and plug in and have Wi-Fi and do their work. And it has become such an interesting space in the different ways that the city has chosen to use it. And all this stuff packs up into the box and can be brought back down again with different layers and different mechanisms. And it's like an urban park in a box. And it's very small and it's very lightweight, and it's just really, really ingenious of identifying a tiny little potential and making so much out of it. An equivalent to this that I can think of in our city is Sayed Sawi. I think even though you can say as architects, yes, the materials that they use are not brilliant, yes, the form is not the most beautiful, but I think it's a very successful project because it identifies potential of a discarded space in a very important location in our city. And I think it's one of the very, very few places where that socioeconomic mix that I was talking about in the Indian project can actually happen. You can have a taxi driver and a director of a bank and a fashion model and an artist and a musician all attending the same event in one space. And that rarely happens in our culture. And I think it's very successful because of the way it has approached its design. The next approach is good design is creating opportunity and designing for possibility. And I always tell my students, design for the unknown, design for what the building can become, design with a little bit of incompleteness for people to be able to complete for themselves later on. Don't define everything very rigidly. And the best project that comes to mind is a project by a group called Sena, another Japanese group of architects, Sajima and Nishizawa. This is the Rolex Learning Center in the Polytechnic in Lausanne. It's a very interesting building, structurally, of course. It's two completely independent waving concrete structures. It waves across this campus. It reminds me of the work of Snøhetta, that it becomes a building as a landscape. It creates these pockets of spaces, so even its footprint on the ground, it hasn't taken up the entire site. So although it's a very, very big building, there's still a lot of open space of the park that's accessible to the public underneath. And they realize that they can use that open space. They do like outdoor cinemas, they do cocktails, they do dinners. In the winter, they turn it into an ice skating rink and people can skate, and they can do all these things underneath the building. In any other building, that underneath space would be gone. It would no longer exist. It's kind of like the Le Corbusier-Piloty idea of a floating building, but in a very different way. And they're very delicate architects. And really what they did with this building is they just created these opportunities for students to decide how they wanted to use this space. Of course, there's a cultural element to this. I don't know necessarily if this would work in any culture. The Swiss culture is very specific in their discipline and self-organization and kind of social respect, that I think internally they would be able to manage a space like that very, very well. May or may not work in other cultures, but again, it's dealing with the landscape that you have at hand. And I'm going to take a look at, again, trying to bring it back home, this idea of good design being social responsibility, building in, for, and with the community. And I'm going to use the work of a man who's very, very dear to my heart, and a man that I worked with for many years, Abdel Halim Ibrahim, He is the winner of the Aga Khan Award for Architecture for his cultural park for children in Sayyida Zainab. It's just down the street, just further down this street is Gamma Ibn Tulun. For any of you who are familiar with the area, I'm sure many of you know of this building. I don't know how many have visited. Unfortunately, visiting it now, today, is a very depressing experience. It isn't what it used to be. But the reason I'm including it is because I think the reason he won the Aga Khan Award wasn't because necessarily it was a beautiful building. It is a beautiful building, it's a beautiful park. But my belief is that he won it because of this wall, which is the wall of the park that connects the park to the city or to the community that is around it. This community, this street is called Shara Abu Dahab, and in designing the park, he initiated an NGO called Jam'iyat Abu Dahab, which would then provide microloans and provide social services for the women of the community. And in his words, I couldn't think of a better barrier for a children's park to protect them than the mothers of the community. So he gave ownership to these little cubicles and allowed, through this microloan system, the women of the community to open up their own businesses. So they became like the barrier where the community could move into the park through this wall of mothers. So it would ensure that I couldn't think of a better way. There would be no security guard in the world who could do as good a job as 100 women from the community, making sure that the right people go in and the right people stay out and the children are kept safe when they're inside the park. And it also gave value to the park. It allowed the community to be part of the park. It identified what the community needed and gave them a sense of ownership. I think one of our problems in our city is that we, as the citizens of the city, don't feel a sense of ownership of our public space. We're afraid. And I think projects like this break down that fear of we have ownership to our city. We have a right to the city. This last project, before I just show you a few of my students' work, because I just love my students so much and love the work that they do, is a very quick project. And I like to end with it because, to me, good design is understanding and integrating everything that's at play. So we've talked about a lot of criteria, but in the end, good design is about doing all of these things, not just one of them. And an example that came to mind is the work of Bjarg Ingels. His firm is called BIG. He's housed in Denmark. I first met him in Barcelona at the Collegiate School of Architecture's meeting in 2012. I was actually presenting some of my students' work about a pavilion for the revolution, which was a great opportunity for him to see our work as well. He, at the time, was hoping to come visit us in Cairo, but the political situation at the time wasn't fantastic for a visit, hopefully in the near future. This is called the 8 House, meaning the figure 8, and you'll see why it's called the figure 8 in a moment. It's a new housing complex in part of Copenhagen, in the extension of Copenhagen, so it's kind of the equivalent of our new communities like Latamea and 6 October. It's where the city is extending along the fjord, along the waterway. He has quite a few projects in this new community called Ørestad in Denmark. And what's most striking to me is every apartment building in this complex, because it's really more than just a building, it's a whole neighborhood of people, is accessible by bicycle. Anyone who has visited Copenhagen knows that the primary way of getting around the city, it's a very small city, the main way of getting around the city is either by public transportation or by bicycle, and everyone has a bicycle. If you go to the Tivoli Garden in the evening, there are no less than 20,000 bicycles parked outside of the people that have parked them out and are, I wish I'd brought a slide of it, I think it's really very effective. So I will leave you with this video that Bjarg talks about. It's in Danish, but there is translation. I can read it along if we don't feel that we can keep up with the reading. That he talks about, sorry, no, that's not the video yet. This is kind of a preview of the video and of the stages that he went through to reach this final, what you would think, a complex form. And I think one of the things that architects and students of architecture don't really understand is they think that what they call concepts are very arbitrary, that an architect looks at a building, oh, I'll make it look like a figure 8, oh, I'll make it look like a star, oh, I'll make it look like a dome, or I'll make it look like the rising sun. And we think that these are kind of romantic, arbitrary, groundless assumptions, but they're not. And he explains it really well why that's the case.
Københavns nyeste kvarter, Ørestaden, er tænkt som en moderne udgave af Frederiksstaden. En helt ny by opført på bar mark. Og hvor intet er alt muligt, så midt på fælleden er der rig mulighed for at udvikle nye former for arkitektur. Med VM-husene har vi tegnet et tredimensionelt puslespil af lejligheder, og med Boligbjerget har vi bygget en menneskeskabt skråning af villahaver. Og for nylig blev vi bedt om at tegne et nyt hus, eller snarere 2 nye huse, nemlig en kæmpe karré og et lille tårn. Her har vi Amagerfælled, som er det her kolossale grønne område midt i København, som er dobbelt så stort som Dyrehaven. Og Københavns Havn kommer her, som strækker sig hele vejen fra Kongelunden, hele vejen ind igennem byen og op til Nordhavnen. Ørestaden ligger så som det her langstrakte slips langs med metroen, som forbinder hele Indre By ud til Amagerfælled. Og her for enden af Ørestaden ligger vores grund i den her nye bydel, som skal være sådan en form for moderne udgave af Frederiksstaden. Hvis vi prøver ligesom at zoome mere ind på den, så er vores opgave simpelthen i den her karré at tegne 500 boliger og 400 arbejdspladser.
Midt på karréen skal der stå et lille tårn. Nabobygningen er et kontorhus. Og frem for at være vokset sammen ved hoften med et andet hus, foreslår vi en urban celledeling ved at rive de 2 karréer fra hinanden, og i samme hug forære bydelen en ny plads.
Hvis vi prøver ligesom at kigge nærmere på den plads, der opstår, så sker der det, at i det sekund, at karréen forsvinder under fødderne på tårnet, så dumper fødderne ned og står lige pludselig midt på den her plads. Og så i stedet for at være sådan en form for underlig appendix på skuldrene af vores egen karré, så bliver det til sådan en fritstående campanile. Lidt som man kender det fra kirketårnet ved Markuspladsen i Venedig. Altså sådan en monolit omgivet af byrum på alle sider. Og eftersom det skal være sådan et københavnsk tårn, som man kender det fra de her traditionelle tårne og spir, vi har i København, så skal det ikke være sådan en stor skyskraber, men det skal være sådan et højt, slankt tårn. Det skal være så slankt, at det faktisk har et fodaftryk på kun 160 kvadratmeter, som svarer til et almindeligt parcelhus, men vel at mærke et parcelhus i 16 etager. Proportionerne er også lagt fast, det skal være 10 gange 16 meter, henvendt mod syd. Man kan sige, i den øverste del af tårnet, der fungerer det fint, så ligger boligen og kigger ud over den her formidable udsigt hen over taglandskabet på vores egen karré. Men i den nederste del, der ligger de og kigger lige ind i ryggen på vores egen bygning. Så der foreslår vi simpelthen at dreje hele underdelen, sådan så boligerne kigger mod sydvest ud mod pladsen. Resultatet er sådan en form for vredent tårn, som har lidt samme formsprog, som man kender det fra sådan en mælkekarton, lige inden den er ved at brase sammen, når man skal smide den ud. Og resultatet, sådan rent arkitektonisk, bliver de her facetterede, trekantede gavlmotiver. Og faktisk her for enden kan man se det, der kunne minde om sådan en traditionel købmandsgård, altså sådan en spids gavl med sadeltag, som er ligesom en del af det her ellers moderne tårn. Det var så det lille tårn.
Nu mangler vi kun de sidste 57.000 kvadratmeter over i den kæmpe store karré.
Men det er jo et stort hus. Et meget stort hus. Faktisk er det så stort, at det står og vipper på kanten mellem at være en bygning og være byplanlægning. Altså et helt kvarter, som er opført på én gang som et hus. Og hvor arkitektur fremstår smukkest med enkle linjer og klare tanker, så fremstår en by mest levende med som oplevelsesrigdom og overraskelser. Så det er på en eller anden måde sådan en paradoksal udfordring på en gang at skabe enkelhed og variation, at skabe forskellighed og sammenhæng. Altså på en måde at skabe en by i bygningen. Og der er man i dag blevet meget mere opmærksom på, når man skaber et nyt kvarter eller en ny bygning, at prøve at genskabe noget af den variation, man finder i den historiske by. Men hvordan genskaber man så den? Jo, man kan fx prøve at lave noget, som ligner den historiske by. Og derfor så har man nogle steder forsøgt at skabe skal vi sige, Nyhavns tilsyneladende variation af forskellige bygninger, ved at få den samme arkitekt til at tegne alle boligerne, og så få nogle forskellige arkitekter til at tegne facaderne. Altså på en eller anden måde en eller anden form for kosmetisk variation, som ligger som sådan et 40 cm tykt lag uden på en ellers fuldstændig ensartet boligmasse. Man kender lidt sådan fra en westernby, hvor man har taget en masse forskellige facader og smækket dem op på nogle ens bagvedliggende barakker. Men vi er egentlig ikke specielt interesseret i den her form for falske forskellighed. Og måske er der ikke den store forskel på, om man bygger 30 meter til højre eller venstre. Men hvis du bygger 30 meter oppe eller nede, er der en verden til forskel. Især hvis du spørger ejendomsmæleren. Men hvad hvis vi i stedet for at simulere forskellige huse ved siden af hinanden, lægger forskellige funktioner oven på hinanden, som en form for urban lagkage, hvor den enkelte aktivitet ligger aflejret oven på den næste. For eksempel så butikker og kontorer, de kan godt lide at have direkte kontakt til kunderne i gadeplan. De kan godt lide at have store sammenhængende etager. Og endelig så har de brug for dagslys, men de hader direkte solskin i øjnene eller på computerskærmen. Så derfor så foreslår vi at lægge hele erhvervsdelen nederst i bygningen. Omvendt så kan boliger, de elsker solskin. Til gengæld så hader de at ligge i stueetagen, hvor folk kan glo lige ind i deres lejlighed. Så derfor foreslår vi at lægge alle boligerne oven på erhvervsdelen. Men nu er det sådan, at butikker og kontorer, de har dybere etager end for eksempel boliger. Så hele vejen langs de nederste boliger opstår der sådan en form for sti eller taghave. Lidt ligesom man kender det fra kartoffelrækkerne ved søerne i København.
Our dean has asked me to explain what's going on, just so we can follow. What he's talking about basically is recreating this neighborhood in a building. The typical Danish neighborhood is houses beside one another, with shops and commercial spaces on the ground floor and residences on the top. What he is proposing in his block is thinking of this as layers and giving each group or each user type its optimum position. So bringing all the commercial and office spaces to the ground, creating duplexes of homes on top, apartment blocks above, and penthouses on the rooftop. What's going on? He's now going to show how he then molds the building around what it needs to be.
Som sådan en form for arkitektonisk symbiose.
He'll get to the
Men i
age.
masterplanen har man samtidig bedt om at få en
So the city asks that there are two plazas in the city that need to have direct access to one another. And they don't want this new neighborhood to block that access. But at the same time, he has this huge plot that he wants to work with and not sacrifice any square meterage of space. So that's why he does this tapering in the middle to make the minimum footprint but still be able to have the maximum area. He's actually increased the area because the inclined line is now longer than the straight line. Those diagonals are actually longer than the straight line, so he's got more space than he had before, and he's given the city the space that they wanted to connect the two plazas to one another. And then now he's going to talk about how he optimizes and molds the building around the movement of the sun. And in the north, the way they deal with daylight is very different than how we do in the south. In the south, you're trying to run away from direct sunlight. You're trying to protect your buildings from the heat of the sun. In Denmark, you're trying to open up your building to the sunlight because they don't get it very long, and it's very cold, and sunlight doesn't represent to them a thermal gain. So here he's showing how he models the movement of the sun to optimize allowing as much sun as possible into the buildings, into those dark corners of the courtyard by molding the building down. And those angles, I mean, he does it just with his hand now, but they're very carefully calculated with regards to the angles of the sun at the different times of the day, in winter versus summer, and so on and so forth. And they do a lot of simulation to show how the sun moves into the different parts of the building throughout the day. And with that fold, he also allows view for the people that are stuck in the corner of the building that would have the view of only their neighbors across the corridor. And also with this ramp or this tuck down of the form, he's brought the building down to the ground to allow pedestrian and cycle access all the way to the top. And there's a really nice part of the video that'll start in a moment that shows you the journey of a person entering the building. So this little red man jogging along will take you on a little tour of how someone would be jogging to their home on the way back from work and move through the building.
It's all yours.
Yes, boss, I'm on my mind. I'll try to give you what you like. I can be soft, I can be hard. Let me do.
It's kind of similar to this village-like quality that we were talking about before, that in villages everything's walkable. In informal settlements everything's walkable, and that's one of the big values of these communities. And one of the big drawbacks of these vertical, dense, large-scale 500-unit communities that he's building is that nothing is walkable. You get on an elevator, it's like that Japanese experience. Your experience is a mechanical experience going up and down elevators in a tower. So through this design, and in making it walkable, he's also made it very human and very social. Because in the walkability of things, there are places where people can meet, where children can play,